Welcome back, or just welcome if you're a new viewer. Today we are going to look at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave played in the 2022 Norway Chess Event. And it was an Armageddon game, so white gets 10 minutes time and black gets only 7 minutes. But if the game ends in a draw, it will be counted as a win for black. So I already put the first few moves on the board. And we have MWL with the black pieces going for the Grünfeld defense instead of going for the for the King's Indian in this position. So he chooses the also quite popular Grünfeld defense, and Magnus, of course, takes, and after black recaptures in the center, there is only one main move, and that is e4 by white. And now this exchange of knights leads to a beautiful pawn center for white. But of course, black is trying to argue that this pawn center will not only be a benefit, but also a liability for black by putting lots and lots of pressures towards the center of the board. And yeah, it can become difficult for white to hold on to this beautiful center. So we have bishop to g7 already preparing to snipe at the center from a distance. And now we have bishop to b5, Magnus going for this check and not the most common move in this position, which is bishop to g4, putting the bishop on this very strong diagonal. Instead, we have bishop to c4 check, and after that MVL of course blocks with c6, and Magnus has to retreat, and once again he gets hunted away by MVL, who plays the move b4. So we have now bishop back to b3, and yeah, finally the bishop ended up on this very strong diagonal, but MVL doesn't like that, so he goes ahead and plays a5, and he doesn't go for b4, which is by far the main move in this position. You're trying to undermine white's pawn center basically. But yeah, MVL goes for a5, basically preparing to push a4 at some point and getting rid of this bishop on this diagonal. So Magnus decides to simply develop, of course, bringing out the knight to f3, and now we have castles by both players. And yeah, here MVL goes for that a4 idea, forcing the bishop back to c2, and now now finally we have the move c5, attacking white center with the pawn at this point. And as white, you really want to get out of this diagonal with your rook. So Magnus goes for rook to b1. You also attack the pawn on b5, because the bishop in the Grünfeld defense for black, the dark squared bishop, is super strong. Yeah, it can make sense to simply move the rook away from the a1 square. So we have now knight to c6, further increasing the pressure on the center. See that there are now already 4 pieces attacking the center, and you have to in some way add another attacker to your d4 pawn, or you can push it. This position has been reached twice. One move that has been tried was d5, which ended up in a win for white. But Magnus doesn't play it. And the other move that was already known is bishop to e3, adding a further defender to this pawn. But Magnus comes up with a new move, and that is e5. So we are in completely new game at this point. And now we have rook to b8, which is actually a little bit of an inaccuracy. The engine would have preferred captures in the center of the board, and then Magnus would have had to throw in e4, actually attacking this knight. And after that, the line could have happened like bishop to f5. Of course, if you now grab the knight, you will lose your bishop in the corner, so you cannot do that. And after something like captures, and once again captures, because you would lose. Yeah, of course you can also recapture with your pawn, but this will lead to further implications after something like queen to d5, attacking here, and also, well, basically blockading this pawn, and it will be lost at some point anyway. So yeah, we don't have this line. We have an inaccurate move, which is rook to b8, as I already pointed out. And now we have bishop to e4 anyway, attacking this knight here on c6. And now we have again this tactical defense idea. Of course, again, you cannot take because you would lose your rook. So instead we have takes. And now we have queen to d3, attacking actually 2 pawns here. And MVL comes up with the best move, protecting this pawn directly with the queen and indirectly protecting the pawn on b5. Because if you were to capture it, you're gonna get hit by knight to e5, attacking everything in your position. And well, if you decide to grab the knight, you're gonna simply lose your rook. And yeah, if you don't grab the knight, there is simply no other good move in the position for white. So you cannot grab the pawn on b5, and you also cannot grab the pawn on f5. So yeah, MVL did a very well job of defending everything in the position. And now we have rook to d1 and rook to d8, so both players bringing their rooks to the central files of the board. And yeah, here also stuff is gonna probably end up opening up quite soon. So Magnus now plays bishop to f4, finishing development. And now we have c takes d4 and c takes d4 once again. So this pawn is getting quite weak. Of course, at this point it's still defended, but it is yeah, very difficult to be able to hold on to this pawn. So we have now e6 by MVL. He is basically locking in this pawn here completely, but is also opening up this diagonal, which Magnus is immediately taking use of by playing bishop to g5, attacking the rook. And also we have now rook d to c8. And Magnus goes queen to e3, which is setting up a battery. You can end up trading off your bishop on this square if you decide to do that. And you're also just simply improving the position of the queen. So we have now knight to e6, and now Magnus plays actually bishop to f6. Not going for h6, which also the ancient would like more, but Magnus decided to go to h6, which is also fine. And of course, you cannot grab the bishop on here, because after Magnus recaptures and attacks your knight, well, if you decide to move the knight out of the way, let's say to g6, well, there will be a queen to h6, and there will be no way of preventing checkmate. So you would not be able to move your knight, and yeah, you would just simply be lost immediately. So this bishop here is untouchable for the moment. And now we have actually the best move once again, and we are finding very nice defensive ideas here, which is h6, which is protecting the queen to basically get to the g5 square. Because, well, let's say you just play a random move around here, well, Magnus is gonna bring in his queen, and then stuff's gonna get very, very uncomfortable here very quickly. You're gonna play knight g6 blocking off, and then h4 is gonna come, h5, but you're gonna have probably yeah, you're just gonna be in a terrible position. So instead of all of that, MVL plays the best move h6, and now queen to f3, which is well, basically preparing to bring the queen over to g3. And also he's keeping an eye on this rooks through x-ray, basically. So this might not seem important just now, but well, keep that point in mind. So we have now g6 attacking the queen, and Magnus moves to g3, well, getting to the opposite side of the king. So MVL decides to move it out of the way to h7, and also maybe in the future bring over a rook in some lines. And yeah, simply this this pawn here is quite weak, and it's also kind of blocking in your own rook. So Magnus simply decides to sacrifice the pawn with d5. The ancient doesn't like it, but it's an Armageddon game. There's not a lot of time. This very aggressive playing style can be rewarded in this mode for sure. So you play d5, and now we have e captures on d5, and now we see Magnus's idea, which is rook to b4. So lifting up the rook and basically preparing to bring it all the way over on to the other side of the board. But MVL, well, he of course cannot allow that, or doesn't want to allow that. So we have rook to c4, basically forcing a trade of rooks, and Magnus goes for it with rook captures on c4, and now b captures on c4. Of course, you cannot take with your center pawn because you would lose your queen. So now we have e6 by Magnus, and notice that in all this maneuvering around, this rook was losing his defender, and yeah, as I already pointed out way earlier, this queen is monitoring this rook on the b8 square, so this move is attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. But of course, you're gonna give up a pawn, you get the rook, and you're also gonna give up the bishop. So now there's huge material imbalances. Magnus is up the exchange, but he is down 2 pawns for it. And yeah, very interesting imbalanced position we got on here. So Magnus decides to play rook to e1, attacking the queen, and MVL goes back to d7. Magnus now brings his rook, brings his queen to b6. He is attacking the queen of, sorry, not the queen. He is attacking the bishop of MVL, and now we have the move king to g7, attacking, sorry, not attacking, protecting the bishop on g7. And now Magnus comes up with a very interesting move, and also notice this time situation. It's getting lower for MVL. He has 1 minute 43 seconds, whereas Magnus still has a bit over 4 minutes. And yeah, Magnus now plays g3, which is a huge blunder. It completely gives away the game, but only and only if MVL finds the move d4, because after d4, these 2 pawns together will be so strong that they will not be able to be protected anymore. After something like queen to c5, attacking this pawn, and yeah, black can simply push the pawn, and then let's say white tries to play rook c1. Black can even play pawn to d3, giving up this pawn. But yeah, you're just gonna lose your knight here, and this will be a completely winning endgame for black. So if MVL finds the move pawn to d4, he will be winning, but he did not. He played f4 instead, and we have now queen back to c5, basically disallowing this push now, because, well, you would simply lose the pawn on c4. So instead we have captures, and now MVL once again coming up with a very interesting move with 1.5 minutes left on the clock, and that is knight to f4. Of course, he's basically arguing, well, if you're gonna take my knight, I'm gonna come here, and well, you're gonna have to move, and I'm gonna win my knight back, and the position is quite imbalanced. And yeah, he of course also wants to trade pieces. He is fine with a draw because he is playing black, and a draw would be like a win for him. So Magnus decides not to grab the knight, but instead plays queen back to e3, attacking the knight this way, and now MVL moves the knight over to d3, also attacking the rook. So Magnus moves over to the open file, to the other open file of the board, which is the b file. Yeah, preparing basically to bring his rook onto a very active square. And yeah, MVL plays queen to e6, offering a queen trade, and Magnus simply ignores it and plays rook to b7, driving in the rook and allowing the queen trade to happen. And now we have c3 by MVL. Whenever you have passed pawns, you might consider pushing them, because that will make it very hard for your opponent to defend it, and you can create very strong threats through pushing them. Because yeah, if they get promoted, the game will simply be won for you. So Magnus tries to stop the pawn by moving behind it, rook to c7, and now MVL goes knight to b4, attacking the pawn and also protecting the c2 square for his own pawn. So yeah, Magnus is quite thinly stretched here. It's gonna get very difficult to defend this, but he has way more time on the clock, still 3.5 minutes, whereas MVL has 40 seconds left. And yeah, Magnus really should go for knight to d4 here, blocking off this bishop from protecting the pawn. But instead he plays knight to e1. He is basically, well, protecting this square here. But this allows, because you stop defending this square, it allows bishop to e5, which is a fork between the pawn and the rook. So the rook has to move, and now MVL grabs the pawn on g3 and also attacks the knight, which is going to get protected by the queen. And now we have a trade by the king, sorry, not the queen. And now we have a trade. And yeah, Magnus is down now 3 pawns, but still up the exchange. And yeah, MVL grabs, well, the second to last pawn of Magnus. So there is, he's now down 4 pawns, but he has a rook, and this knight is quite stuck at the edge of the board. And also MVL is very low on time by now, 26 seconds. So we have now king to d1. You really want to bring over your king, bring it to a very active square, and be able to maybe pick off the knight and also pick off the pawns, pick up the pawns. So we have now a3. MVL keeps pushing the pawns, and now we have rook to b8. He's basically not allowing the knight to get out anymore, and this square is now already protected by the king, so the rook can stop defending this square. Now we have h5 by MVL. He starts pushing his pawns all over the board, on all sides of the board, and now Magnus comes with king c2, getting closer to the knight, and now h4 by MVL. So yeah, there are now multiple pawns which are close to the promotion square, but MVL's king is super passive. Well, he will need to activate it at some point, and his time keeps getting lower and lower and lower. 16 seconds is not a lot of time to play chess. So we have now rook down to b1. He is, of course, you don't want to play a move like king to b1, attacking the knight here, because, well, even a move like h3 is winning for black, because you will not be able to stop the pawn here, because you cannot swing over to the h8 square, and also the b1 square is basically blockaded by your own king. So be careful not to do that. So Magnus first brings the rook back, and only after that he brings the king over to b3, attacking the knight, and now the knight is completely stuck. There's no way out for the knight. But yeah, MVL in a very low time situation decides to go for knight to b4, which gives a huge advantage to white. But in the low time situation, it doesn't really matter anymore anyway. Magnus grabs the knight, and now we have a2. Again, completely winning for white. White should really give this check here on f1, but Magnus instead goes to the corner, and now it's a completely drawn position again. So we have now c2. So there are already two pawns, 1 square away from promotion only. And now we have king to c3. Of course, you cannot promote any of the pawns, since the rook on the first rank does a super good job of protecting everything. So we have now h3 with super low time. These moves just get blitzed out, and yeah, Magnus picks off the pawn. And in this position, it was a super low time situation, but MVL played another move which completely gave up the game. There's only one move in this position, which is holding a draw for black, and I want you to find this move. So please pause the video for a few seconds if you want. If not, I'm just gonna tell you the move, and the move is king to f5. It's quite difficult to spot probably, but you want to activate your king, and it should be close towards the center of the board, but also towards your h-pawn to be able to protect it. And instead of that, MVL played, he played king to g5, giving up the full game. And now we have king to d3, which was the last move of the game. MVL's time is over, and also his position is dead lost. So yeah, very unfortunate turn of events. And I think there you can really see the problem with this time format. Armageddon 10 minutes versus 7 minutes. I think it's a little bit too big of a difference. We see white winning over and over and over again, and black really has a very minor chances of winning in this format. So yeah, I think I'm not the only one who would like to see a change in the time format. But anyway, it was a very nice game by both players. And yeah, in the end, it was decided by some time problems, which of course is part of the game, and you know before the game starts how much time you're gonna get. But still, it's of course nicer to see for us viewers if the game gets decided on the board. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this. Leave me some feedbacks in the comments, because I really want to improve my videos. And as always, thanks for watching.